You've heard this one before. Maybe it's a beautiful siren singing a gorgeous song only to lure unsuspecting sailors onto the rocks and eventually to their death. Or a snake promising you a delicious apple only to curse all of humanity with the knowledge of good and evil. Or a wolf disguising itself as an old woman to trick the innocent child into letting it into their house only to have the beast devour the youngster as prey. Or maybe a demon posing as a child's playmate, maybe using the name Captain Howdy or something like it, only to trick the child into letting an ancient evil entity possess them bodily, unleashing a series of horrors and torments that you only really hear in horror stories. This episode of Theater History and Mysteries is our version of The War of the Worlds, a story that is entirely made up as a good Halloween story to entertain the audience prone to good ghost stories. That's you, I hope. The events here are mostly made up, but the twist is all the dates, actors, and even the seances are confirmed historical events. This isn't a ghost story about what really happened, but one that could have. Taking a new turn, I'll try as hard as I can to blur fact and fiction in this episode of Theater History and Mysteries, and if you get a chance, replay this on Halloween. I'm John Bruschke, and you are listening to Theater History and Mysteries, where I take a musical theater production, go into a deep dive on the questions it raises and the answers it provides. I hope that this approach will give a deeper understanding about the lessons that the musical has for theater and for life, and I will never miss an opportunity to pursue any mystery, bizarre coincidence, improbable event, or supernatural suggestion along the way because, in the words of Dirk Gently, it is all connected. This episode is completely different than anything I've done on the show. Today, I will start by inventing a completely made-up story, one entirely consistent with the known facts, but that, prior to today, has never been told. The historical record does support the T.S. Eliot, the author of a book called Old Possum's Guide to Practical Cats, like telling and hearing good ghost stories. The prior episode went over his involvement in the occult. And in the past episodes, we have talked about the way Victor Hugo held seances in his production of Les Mis. Here's hoping that this is a ghost story that Eliot would have liked, or more important, at least one that you like. As they say in show business, on with the show.
They never find out anything. But you can try.
On April 23rd, 1616, William Shakespeare died. He was buried 2 days later in the Holy Trinity Church, which still stands next to Trinity College. At his death, there was a curse written on his tomb. Naturally, it's written in verse, and this is how it reads. Good friend, for Jesus' sake forbear, to dig the dust enclosed here. Blessed be the man that spares these stones, and cursed be he that moves my bones. That's an amusing little pair of couplets, but hardly worthy of the greatest author of the English language. It's almost childish. Our story will pass through Shakespeare. In fact, it will pass through Victor Hugo, the Salem witch trials, and the Channel Islands off of France more than once. But it ends at T.S. Eliot, who crossed paths also more than once with demons. In earlier episodes, I dwelt, perhaps more than I should have, on the strangely recurrent reference to demons that surfaced in the life of T.S. Eliot repeatedly, and they show up unexpectedly early in his life. Peter Ackroyd has been introduced in earlier shows. He's a biographer, graduate of Cambridge, fellow at Yale, and recipient of numerous literary awards. Ackroyd recounts this story from Eliot's youth when he went to a dentist, picked up a collection of Edgar Allan Poe's works lying around for some light reading, and in the words of Ackroyd, quote, Eliot described how the lines so affected him that he could not rest until he had read the poem entire. Here is a boy, attracted to the melancholy cadence of the couplet and to the sonorous low tones of its vowels. He was to describe this immersion in poetry as a sort of, quote, demonic possession, end quote, since he began scribbling verses in a similar tone and style, end quote. That passage is cited as coming from an interview that Eliot gave to the Paris Review in 1959, and the rest of Ackroyd's discussion is concerned with how Eliot, as a very young writer, had an uncanny ability to copy the style of any poet or writer he was trying to imitate. And for us, it's interesting that he seemed to be drawn to Poe, a true pioneer in literature concerned with the macabre and the supernatural, and that he described reading Poe as being like demon possession. His next encounter with demons is as a graduate student at Harvard. Donald J. Childs of the University of Ottawa is a serious scholar, and he found a set of notes that Eliot took on a book by Pierre Janet. Childs saw the beginning of some themes that later developed in Eliot's masterpiece poem called The Wasteland. And note the particular emphasis on demons in this passage. Quote, "The notes echo in a more general way The Wasteland, 1922. There is the same visit to the spiritualist, Madame Sosostris. There is the same discovery of malignant spirits, the poisonous belladonna and the crooked merchant. There is the same England-Switzerland setting, and there was the same foreign voices and the same demons, note the capital D, the latter appearing in The Wasteland in quotations from the Brihadaranyaka Upanishad," end quote. So this poem adds two more references to demons. That very long word Indian phrase at the end there is something that's quoted in the poem The Wasteland, and it's a reference to some mystical writing in Indian. So this poem adds two more references to the demons, one in his notes as a student and one as the poem that made him famous. There is a fourth reference to demons that I'd like to call attention to. T.S. Eliot was giving some lectures to the National Book League in Westminster, and he needed to come up with some original content. He was already one of the greatest American literary figures of the 20th century, and he was trying to say something about poetry that had not been said before. What he came up with was published under the title The Three Voices of Poetry, and on page 18 it includes this passage, quote, "He, the poet, is oppressed by a burden which he must bring to birth in order to obtain relief, or to change the figure of speech, he is haunted by a demon against which he feels powerless, because in its first manifestation, it has no face, no name, nothing. And the words, the poem he makes, are kin of a form of exorcism to his demon. He may experience a moment of exhaustion, of appeasement, of absolution, and of something very near annihilation, which is itself indescribable," end quote. This passage itself is famous, and if you start looking into T.S. Eliot, it's one that pops up a lot. James E. Miller, the Helen A. Rugenstein Professor Emeriti of English at the University of Chicago, was interested in tracing the biography of Eliot and seeing what it could do to help him interpret Eliot's poem The Wasteland. He titled the book Personal Demons, a re-examination of the wasteland. Miller is a little focused on the sexual angle of T.S. Eliot's life, so he's talking about a pretty corporeal demon. But he quotes that passage from the Three Voices of Poetry lecture in a preface to his book. Whatever they were, Miller is pretty sure that Eliot had demons, maybe just metaphorical, but powerful enough to inspire the focus of the book. So for Eliot, there's definitely some connection between the poems he has inside of him and what he imagines demon possession to be like. Or more tantalizingly, maybe he already knows what demon possession is like. And that's why the comparison shows up when he's describing the first experience with Poe to the Paris Review, and why demons show up in the course notes and in his greatest poem, and why he finally chose to describe demon possession as the metaphor in his famous lecture to the National Book Club. But what if demons are real? There are many, many accounts that they are, including the Bible, medieval guides to treating demons, and even supposedly the real story that came to inspire the 1973 horror classic, The Exorcist. The tale I will tell now has the demons are real, and it starts in China in the year 1279. The Song dynasty has been ruling for hundreds of years. They printed Confucian classics with movable type, and art, and especially poetry, thrived under their rule. No less an authority than the Encyclopedia Britannica describes it this way, quote, "The Song dynasty is particularly noted for the great artistic achievements that encouraged it, and in part it subsidized. The Baisong dynasty in Bianjiang had a renewal of Buddhism and of literature and the arts. The greatest poets and painters of the empire were in attendance at the court. The last of the Northern Song emperors was himself, perhaps the most noteworthy artist and art collector of the country," end quote. But all this art and culture were not to last. In 1211, no less a warrior than Genghis Khan attacked the northern kingdom. His grandsons would finally conquer the north, but the south forged on. Poetry was a passing concern in the last passage that I just read, but among all the arts the Song dynasty cultivated the most, it was poetry. One last tidbit from the Encyclopedia Britannica, quote, the literature of the Song dynasty emphasized the return to old-time simplicity of expression in prose, and short tales called guwen were written in great volume. A school of oral storytelling in the vernacular arose, and conventional poetry enjoyed wide circulation. Song poets achieved their greatest distinction, however, in the new genre of the chi, sung poems of joy and despair. The poems became the literary hallmark of the dynasty, end quote. Aside from poetry, popular throughout the period were the famed Li Tang curse charms. Their purpose was to ward off curses. They are the coins that have the square holes instead of the round ones, and they were prayers said to the Taoist god of thunder to ward off evil spirits. Some even thought that the orders inscribed on the coins, warding off nefarious supernatural forces, came directly from the thunder god himself. One particular demon that was widely feared was Ni Jia, the child demon who killed with a flaming spear. His myth is so enduring that there was a movie by this name in 2019, and it was a global hit. Almost as if, somehow, Neja has managed to live on. The purpose of these coins, warding away evil, stood in stark contrast to the Artukids of Mardin. These circulated in Turkey between 1176 and 1184, putting them just around after the fall of the Northern Song Empire, but well in advance of the fall of the South. According to coin collector Long Xiu, these coins did not ward off curses, but carried them. Only, however, under very specific circumstances. Quote, the bottom three lines of their verse text are, cursed is he who abuses the dirham, end quote. The dirham is the name of the coin. A very interesting coin is being the first, in my experience, which explicitly carried a curse for the people who abuses the coin. Whilst a warning of death for counterfeiting is known to exist, this coin appeals to the spiritual or religious sentiments of the people instead in the form of a curse. Abuse of the coin, in this case, is expected to be damage, counterfeiting, or like activities which may devalue the coin, end quote. If you damage an Artukid coin, you don't ward off curses, you invite them. The one place the poetry and the coins all came together was in the Gatha hymns adopted by the Buddhist monks who thrived under the song. And let me just say, all my attempts to pronounce any Chinese word here are approximate. It is a tone of language that just does not ring into my ear, I'm afraid. So I'll spelling them out, and the transcript will have the exact spellings. According to Jason Protas, in his contribution to the Kuroda Studies in East Asian Buddhism series by the University of Hawaii Press, quote, although much has been written about the verses in Gong'an tradition, very little is known about the large corpora, roughly 30,000 extant poems composed by these monastics, end quote. There was something peculiar about these monks and their poetry, a distinct form of hypergraphia, that's a term that literally means obsessive writing, among them was so common that they had a term to describe it, and it's the title of Protas's book, The Poetry Demon. And these monks, given as most monastics are to communal life that generally steers clear of material acquisitions, kept mostly non-economic possessions in something like a library/museum of the day. Their shelves included items of artistic value, including their own poems, of course the hymns their poetry derived from, a passel of Latin coins to keep the demons inspiring their poetry at bay, and a small handful of Artukid coins that they kept next to them. Their Chinese being a little better than their Turkish, the monks knew the coins also fended off evil spirits, but they didn't know about the curse that came if the coins were damaged. It all came to an end in 1279 at the Battle of Yamen. This time the enemy was the Yuan, not the Huns. And 1 year before the battle in 1278, the Song general Wei Tianzhong was captured, which effectively eliminated the Song land forces. By design, the Song knew they could no longer resist the Yuan in a land battle, so leaving all land assets behind or destroyed, they shifted all their resources into building ships. Zhang Shiji commanded the Song Navy, and more than anything, he was afraid of desertion, so he ordered 1,000 ships to be chained together to prevent individual ships from fleeing. He also refused to secure a viable retreat corridor, and for good measure, he ordered that all palaces, houses, and forts be burned to the ground. The Song would have to fight to the death, and death would come. Their ports cut off, the seamen had little food or fresh water and no way to supply either one. As a ruse, the Yuan played festive music and flew large, colorful cloths on their boats to suggest that a feast was at hand. Falling for the bait and expecting that their enemy would be unprepared, the Song attacked, but the soldiers lying in wait emerged from the cloth and slashed the starving and surprised Song attackers into bloody bits. There was a desperate attempt to save the emperor on the 12 best ships, but it failed, and the prime minister drowned himself and the boy king, who was left to rule the Song rather than submit to the slaughter. What remained of the ships was seized, including the trunk holding the demon poet's meager possessions, including some now hopelessly mixed and fire-damaged coins that had been splattered with the blood of the butchered Song defenders. The Song dynasty was over, and all that remained was the trinkets of their culture dispersed across the globe as the vanquishers saw fit. According to the Smithsonian Magazine in 2021, 2 sets of Song dynasty coins have been discovered in England between 2018 and 2021. Somehow, those coins made it to England by the 16th century. William Shakespeare's death was momentous enough that he got a curse on his tomb, but otherwise it was not spectacular. Victor Hugo's funeral was attended by a number of people that exceeded the total population of Paris, but Shakespeare just had send-off befitting a prominent retiree. He was a known playwright at the time of his death in 1616, but his place in literary history did not come until the first folio was published 7 years later in 1623. That's a curious gap. If you look up commonplace sources like biography.com, you'll find phrases like, quote, Shakespeare's final days are shrouded by uncertainty, end quote. But there are suspicions. His son-in-law was a well-known physician who lived in the house. He left extensive medical records of many of his patients, including his wife, who was Shakespeare's eldest daughter, but he left nothing in writing about the great William. William probably hadn't been doing too well. He hadn't written anything in the 3 years before his death, so he probably did need medical attention, or at least he needed the attention of someone who could attend to his ailments, whatever those were. Even stranger, William had updated his will only 1 week before his death, where he described himself as, quote, in perfect health and memory, God be praised, end quote. He signed the document 3 places, but his handwriting was notably shakier than it had been on the vast majority of his surviving work. It was like he just had some intense medical event, then fully recovered, albeit in a weakened state, put his affairs in orders, and then passed. What could account for that? And famously, he left most of his possessions to his daughter, but to his wife, Anne Hathaway, he left only his, quote, second best bed with the furniture, end quote. His fame would wait 7 years until a guy named John Hemmings and a pal of his named Henry Condell compiled the first folio, the collection of Shakespeare's writing. It was that book that launched William into literary history. So to put it together, they had to, of course, go through all of his available papers. They were curious about one document that was mixed in with all the rest. It was a bill of lading that listed a transaction between 15th century Stratford locals and some traveling Chinese traders. The chest of curios, coins, and some Chinese writing, presumably poetry, was stored at a house on Henley Street that eventually belonged to one John Shakespeare, William's father. Presumably, that chest had been purchased, fell into the hands of John Shakespeare, and then was passed on to William on his father's death. And presumably, his hands had touched those coins. One other curiosity is that, and I'm now quoting biography.com directly, quote, in March 2016, researcher Kevin Calls from the Center of Archaeology at Stratford University revealed he had uncovered evidence using radar technology that Shakespeare's skull is likely missing from his grave, end quote. Now, as early as 1879, there were published accounts of attempts at grave robbery committed by a local doctor named Frank Chambers. The Stratford Society put together a 56-page article on that episode that was first published in 1894, but was last updated in 2016. Both the BBC and the National Geographic have taken up the tale of Shakespeare's head, and they don't come to many firm conclusions, including whether or not the skull is even missing. But Frank Chambers, who does appear to have been born, has no official record of his death. He simply went missing. But there was an unidentified corpse found 2 miles from Stratford in 1880 that showed signs of having been hit by arrows and then burned beyond recognition. That trunk of coins and curios no longer resides on the Henley Avenue in Stratford-on-Avon. Their whereabouts are not specifically known, but one curious tale provides some clues, or at least some good stories, The Channel Islands sit off the coast of France, and with some notable exceptions, they have generally fallen under English rule for as far back as written records go. Our first traveler to those islands arrives in the 1600s. A young preacher named Increase Mather received his undergraduate degree at Harvard, crossed the Atlantic Ocean, and then got a master's in divinity at Trinity College in Dublin. Trinity is one of, ironically, 3 sister schools, with the other 2 in Oxford and Cambridge, and a fourth and more distantly related school is the Trinity College in Stratford-on-Avon, which houses the Trinity Church, which, as we know, is the location of both the birth, according to records, and burial of William Shakespeare, which we've already talked about. It was to Trinity College in Stratford that Increase Mather made an intellectual pilgrimage sometime between his time in Dublin and later on, when he had a documented presence in London. Whether he met anyone or acquired anything while in Stratford is not known, but his own autobiography traces his steps from there. Quote, "In April 1659, I transported myself into Guernsey. There I lived at Castle Cornet and preached every Lord's Day, in the forenoon at the castle and in the afternoon at the town called Petersport, where many French people who could understand English were my auditors. Finding the Sabbath to be much profaned in that island, I preached the 4th commandment according to my weak ability." End quote. Those, the direct words from Increase Mather from his autobiography. The island, and in fact several Channel Islands, were reputed to be haunted long prior to his arrival, which might explain why the Sabbath was so profaned in his eyes. As we discussed in earlier episodes, Jersey has a series of druid stones with a large number of ghost stories to match. In particular, there's a white lady reputed to have killed her own children, and Guernsey is no less haunted. Increase Mather did not spend a long time in Guernsey, and after his departure, he would shortly make his way into history. In 1661, he returned to Boston, earned the first doctorate Harvard ever conferred, fathered a son named Cotton, and was ordained as the minister of the North Church. You'll remember that as the place that hung the lanterns to signal Paul Revere a century later. But by 1681, Increase Mather was the sitting president of Harvard, the first doctorate recipient in the history of Harvard, and its president by 1681. In that same year, he began working on a manuscript that would later detail the history of witches, and which would go by the short name Remarkable Providences, and included several first-hand accounts of witchcraft and demon possession. In it, he cited the Malus Maleficarum. He made it very clear that he believed in the real power of witchcraft. The book was published in 1684. It had the effect of establishing the reality of witches in Boston and its neighboring towns, including a small village named Beverly and its kitty corner cousin, Salem. In 1692, the town of Salem would have a very, very eventful year. As the leading theologian at the leading university, Increase Mather was called upon to weigh in on the witch trials. He did so from the pulpit, and in his follow-up book titled, quote, "Cases of Conscience Concerning Evil Spirits," end quote, he called for restraint in the witch trials, but he could never denounce them as farcical or fundamentally flawed. His was, relatively speaking, a voice of restraint. His son Cotton showed far less reserve and provided the only comprehensive book on the witch trials that is contemporaneous to the period. Compared to Increase, Cotton was all in. Witches and demons were real, and the trials were necessary to stop them. Knee-deep in these proceedings, the witch trials, was one Andrew Elliot, who was involved in 3 distinct ways. Andrew was the first-generation immigrant of the line that would eventually produce T.S. Eliot, and he encountered the witch trials in 3 different ways. There are a couple of different sources on this, but the one that really impresses me is Marilyn Roach's day-by-day account of the witch trials and careful citation of original sources documents everything included in the book's 698 pages. If there is a document from the time that details something that happened in Salem in 1692, Marilyn Roach has it in her book. It is fantastic. Now, Andrew is not in the book very much, but he does appear. First, he accused a widow of witchcraft. Both he and the widow lived in Beverly, Massachusetts, in the same house, a village adjacent to Salem. They were both boarders in the house. They were not romantically involved. And in a written record that still survives, it survives so much that I'm going to put the link to a picture of it in the show notes. He claimed that he could hear banging in her room as if someone was levitating and hitting the ceiling. And he could hear as many as 5 or 6 different voices talking, although the woman should have been alone. The widow was arrested on the basis of his accusation, and there's no record of what happened to her. Her name was on the list of those arrested, but there's no surviving account of what happened to her. And if there had been one, believe me, Marilyn Roach would have put it in there. A bunch of the other people arrested at the same time and on the same day as that widow do appear as having been put in prison, but there's no record of what happened to the person that Andrew accused. It is as if she disappeared. The second way he was involved is that he was a juror on one of the witch trials. He and his fellow members of the Veneermen found the accused guilty. And then third and finally, he, along with a bunch of other citizens and jurors from Salem, signed a document recanting their involvement in the whole mess that, as history records, involved joining a mass mob purge that killed scores of their very innocent neighbors. The document also survives, and I'm also posting a link to that in the show notes. Those are very historically accurate events. Andrew Elliot, the very first Elliot in a long line of Elliots that would eventually end with TS, was very much involved in the Salem witchcraft incidents of 1692. As was Harvard president Increase Mather, and as was his son Cotton Mather. Another author, one Robert Califf, wrote that Cotton played a key role in fomenting the hysteria behind the witch trials. Indeed, that Cotton Mather defended and excused the trials more than anyone else. Increase Mather is said to have burned a copy of Califf's book in the Harvard yard. But these personal squabbles aside, both Mathers thought that witches were real, and why not? Increase had seen them before throughout Europe and on the island of Guernsey, and he had written a book to prove it. Interestingly, Cotton Mather sought to follow in his father's footsteps and lead Harvard as its president. He made a pitch 3 times, but he missed out on all 3 chances. Others were chosen instead. No matter, fed up with the burgeoning liberalism that had soured his faith, he was mad at Harvard for going too left anyway. Cotton would pick up his stakes and go on to found his own university with a fellow named Yale. Increase Mather, as Harvard's first doctoral recipient and an early president, left a large number of crucial historical documents that are still housed and cataloged in the Harvard Library, as you would expect. Included are a collection of coins, which the library notes have curious holes in the middle of them, and a note indicating that they were obtained in the Castle Cornet. Even in the earliest days of the library, the materials couldn't be checked out, but the oldest pages do list visitors to the special collection, and one visitor was Andrew Elliot. The witch trials faded into history. There are debates to this day about whether or not Cotton Mather encouraged or moderated the witch trials, but there is no doubt he and his father Increase believed in witches. Almost 2 centuries after Increase Mather had been the pastor in Castle Cornet, in 1850, Victor Hugo and a patchwork entourage of family and friends had been exiled from France and arrived on the Channel Islands, initially staying on the Isle of Jersey in 1850, but moving to Guernsey in about 1853. But not before they held hundreds of seances and experienced numerous hauntings. His family described Hugo as entering several trance-like states. He would later, in fact, have to deny that the poetry he wrote while he was there was inspired by ghosts from beyond the grave. And one very, very notable entity Hugo and his family encountered was the spirit of none other than William Shakespeare, who heartily engaged his French language fellow genius. Through the seances, Shakespeare dictated the entire first scene of a new play. You can find a copy of that today, and there are references to it in our episode on Victor Hugo. The seances ended abruptly, with one of the house guests going mad and Hugo's son Charles flatly refusing to serve as the medium anymore. Within months, and citing political reasons, the Hugos left the island of Jersey. From Jersey, the entire ensemble, as I've mentioned, moved to the nearby island of Guernsey, but they failed to escape the spirits. In fact, the house they moved into was abandoned by its previous occupant because it was haunted. More than that, Guernsey hosted the Castle Cornet that housed the island's governor. In 1672, a few decades after Increase Mather had left the island for Boston, the tower that held the governor's personal chambers was hit with a bolt of lightning. That event required a full inventory of what was recovered from the rubble, and that list includes what you would expect of a British governor to possess, with one notable exception. There is one box noted simply as, quote, damaged and degraded, bearing the initials J.S., end quote. The contents are listed simply as, quote, dross and unusables, perhaps metal of the melted variety, end quote. There is no number indicating how many coins and no way to say whether some of them had been removed, either before or even after the lightning strike. But there is one other strange tale about this castle. During a later excavation, the skeleton of a 16th century man was uncovered. Where his stomach should have been were found a collection of coins. The body was on the island of Guernsey and adjacent to the Castle Cornet, and it was on that island that Victor Hugo finished Les Mis. And then finally, T.S. Eliot was born in 1888. He attended Harvard between 1906 and 1909, and the president at that point was Charles Eliot, a distant cousin of his, but not so distant that the two couldn't talk, and not so distant that Eliot didn't visit and asked to see the library archives, a request that the president of the university was happy to grant. They were both interested in what their first-generation ancestor Andrew had been up to with the collection. And as they were both men of letters, they wanted to see the original documents that had been left by Increase and Cotton Mather. And it was here that T.S. Eliot touched those coins. In early 1915, he met Vivian Haywood, and they were married less than 3 months later in late June, inviting neither family. No one could explain this whirlwind pace, why they got married so quickly or why they were so secretive. There was not a baby involved. It was not true love. They both fell in poor physical and mental health quickly. They argued constantly. They did not even honeymoon through the summer. They invited guests to join them. Their tumultuous relationship tormented them both. Starting in the 1930s, Eliot would then describe the writing of poetry as akin to or perhaps identical to demon possession, and he would later write that the poems he had written in the 1920s might have been the product of automatic writing, and we've talked about that in the prior episode. Eliot would say that he had only been happy before he met Vivian and after she passed, which she did, totally insane, in 1947. She'd been in the asylum since 1938, and Eliot never visited her. Those are a lot of disparate ideas, suggestions, and mysteries. Our tale ends here, but it has a lot of holes in it. Fortunately for us, the Theosophist Society has tied all those loose ends together in an anonymously authored manuscript which has never been published or even duplicated and exists solely in the archival locations that the Society refuses to disclose. The document also relies on a series of revelations revealed in a seance that exist in no other written record, and they don't source where the seance was held or who it was that was recording the minutes of that seance, but it is definitely inside the document. The document goes like this. At the Battle of Yamen, the protective Li Ting coins were in a cabinet that also held the Artukid coins. The Li Tings protected the demonic monks so that when they were possessed, they could expel the demons from their bodies when the poetry had been written. But when the damaged Artukid coins unleashed their curses, the coins themselves carried the demons. The particular curse they held was that their shiny, inviting, and potentially valuable nature drew the poets to touch them. And once touched, the spirit of the demon passed into the human body. The poetry spilled out. The demon stayed until it either jumped from its host to another or was returned to the coin. And one particular demon trapped in one particular coin was the child demon Ni Zhu. This was a phenomena called possessed possessions, which refers to a demon being transferred through a physical object, and that was of intense interest to the Theosophists. After the battle, the Chinese traders brought the coins to England, where they were purchased by John Shakespeare, and his son William found and touched the coins. A demon entered his body, producing some of the greatest verse in English history. The same demon poets that had inspired the monks in China were what were inspiring William Shakespeare. But William was aware of the demon and the split it made between he and his wife, who remained devoted to each other but were never really able to fully connect. Toward the end of his life, and in an attempt to return the demon to the coin, he opened the cabinet again and grabbed the shiniest coin. The demon did not exit him. Ni Zhu entered. He could write no longer and spent the last 3 years in a state of demonic possession. His son-in-law and attending doctor left no records because he was recognizing no symptoms, that he knew that if you put down that Shakespeare had been possessed by a demon, Shakespeare would be excommunicated from the church and could not have a holy burial. As retribution, the child demon changed William's will in his last days, largely disinheriting his wife and altering his signature to that of a child. Shakespeare's revenge was that as he was passing, he refused to touch his wife to deny the demon another host to jump into, and the demon then had no choice but to return to the coins. The poems on the tombstone were the most that Niju could inspire, but Niju was serious about the curse, and when Frank Chambers disturbed the body, the child demon used his flaming arrows to murder him as he fled from Stratford-on-Avon. The coin sat undisturbed until a visiting scholar, Increase Mather, found the box and, wishing to study it further, took the box on the promise that he would either return it after his travels or pay for what it was worth. He took it to the Isle of Guernsey with him, and breaking his promise, he took the coins with him when he returned to America. When he needed to pack, he had to leave some items behind, so he pocketed only the shiniest coins and a few of the others he left behind in Guernsey. Those were picked up by a passing sentry hoping to resell them. He had the misfortune of carrying the coins in a bag around his waist, so when the bag ripped, the coins fell onto his stomach. The demons exited the coins into his body, consumed him whole, and all that was left was the corpse for archaeologists to discover centuries later. The demons returned to the coins and stayed in the castle. The death had released the demons into the air, but they were concealed into the castle cornet, and so when Victor Hugo arrived at the island, he lived near the castle. The psychic energy of the demon poets played at his mind and haunted him from inside the castle. The influence would remain on him while he wrote his poetry and his novels in his own home that he was living in just outside of it. They compelled some of his best verse, and the same demon that had infested Shakespeare appeared to Victor Hugo in the seance, pretending to be the bard. It was no feat to persuade Hugo that the voice was that of Shakespeare, because Shakespeare's voice had been that of the demon all along. Meanwhile, the coins Increase Mather took with him went to Harvard. There he gave all the coins but the shiniest away to a local resident, Andrew Elliott. Andrew carried the coins back to Salem. The population, primed to believe in the reality of witches and demons, took the matter too far. But the demons released by Andrew Elliott's coins were real. Increase and Cotton Mather were both correct. In a rare moment of agreement between Harvard and Yale, innocents had been killed, but the demons afflicting the girls were real, and that was the position both Increase and Cotton Mather maintained throughout their life. This explains why so many of the charges were obviously fabricated, but so much of the torment of the girls, the fevers, the levitations, the speaking in tongues, were the kind of things that just couldn't be faked. The last of the coins was the shiniest, holding the spirit of Niju. When T.S. Eliot asked his cousin, then president of Harvard, to show him the Andrew Elliott archives, he touched the coin and was possessed by both Niju and another spirit that entered his body. When he met Vivian Haywood, she was already troubled but enthusiastic about the occult. With the help of Alfred Orage, Vivian and Eliot attempted a ceremony to expel the demons from T.S. It was partially successful. One demon jumped from Eliot to Vivian, and Niju's demon stayed inside of T.S. Eliot. Vivian already had a delicate constitution. Possession by the demon only made it worse. They married quickly and lovelessly to try to contain the truth and did not invite their families because they didn't want anyone to know about the demons that they had experimented with and that were possessing them. Eliot composed his greatest work, The Wasteland, while both he and Vivian were convalescing, inspired and compelled by the demons who had forced their poetry through the demon poets centuries earlier, but now, unrestrained by charms to hold them in, were at large in the bodies that they were occupying. The references to Shakespeare, in fact, the lines taken directly from the works of Shakespeare, confirm the presence of a single malevolent force dictating both lines. And for a time, Niju became dominant. In the voice of a child, rowdy, nationalistic, and xenophobic, he inspired Old Possum's Guide to Practical Cats. In it, he tried to inspire T.S. Eliot to take up the story of a damned woman, and he tried to force a version of Villon's La Belle Une Mere into a set of poems. Eliot, accustomed to trying to maintain his own personality while knowing he was possessed, fended off the demon and buried the poem, leaving only fragments behind in a list of uncompleted work. And that's why Eliot's biographers, especially Peter Ackroyd, note his tendency to seem aloof. He could be perfectly polite, but still cold, as if studying you from the distance as a lab result rather than as a human. Eliot's personality was constantly being pushed backwards. He was constantly trying to have normal human interactions while housing a demon inside his body, and that's what gave him his detached demeanor. His experiments with the occult having gone so disastrously wrong, he joined the Anglican Church. There he found solace and, standing on holy ground, kept the demon even more deeply buried in the recesses of his mind, but it never completely eliminated it. The church could help, but it could never perform an exorcism. And so, in 1933, T.S. Eliot, Vivian, and Araj made one final attempt to free them both from the demons. Araj had discovered an incantation based on the Lei Ting that would eliminate the curse. The spirits would be cast from the coins, but at a cost. When the ceremony was complete, both spirits would enter a single human vessel determined by a coin toss, and it was not possible to know in advance which one. The two must never meet again unless the demon would return to its original host and the spell be broken. Vivian and Eliot, bound by so much tragedy and so much trauma, made the sacred pact with each other. Araj performed the ceremony. He tossed the coin. It fell in Eliot's favor, and the demons entered Vivian. Eliot left the continent for America to eliminate any accidental contact. He had Vivian serve divorce papers in his absence. The first toll was taken against Araj, who passed away only 2 years later in 1935. Eliot wrote an obituary, although nobody could figure out why he had taken up the task, nor why it should appear in a literary journal he was editing, one that didn't usually publish obituaries, and we've talked about this in the previous episode. Vivian suffered until the end, her mind tormented, her body afflicted, just as if she had been possessed in Salem. Eliot could not visit, and at any rate, he was racked by guilt. He couldn't move forward to his life until her passing in 1947, and even after that, it took a decade. But Eliot was able to piece himself together and married Valerie Fletcher, his secretary of his literary estate, in 1957. He never shared the demonic encounter with her. That made her utterly unaware that when she turned over the scraps of the Grisabella poem to Andrew Lloyd Webber, she was handing him a demonically inspired tale that should not have been brought to the stage, which gives us the final interpretation of one of the most poorly understood productions in the entire history of haunted theater. Grisabella wins the contest, but it's a cheat. It's bait for the trap. Grisabella is not ascending to heaven, but to the third place, that purgatory, that netherland between heaven and earth, the space that first drew T.S. Eliot to the occult. The Heaviside layer isn't heaven, it's hell on earth, a trap to capture souls, just as the Artukid coins had captured victims for centuries, just as the wolf had captured Little Red Riding Hood. At least, that's what the Theosophists believed. Okay, just to be perfectly clear, that story is a fabrication and one I'm pursuing because I'm a huge fan of The War of the Worlds and it follows the conceit of that production. There are, however, a lot of historical facts in there, but the story is mine. I promised an accounting and here it is. A stunning amount of that story is historically accurate. In fact, just about everything in here is historically accurate except for the coins and where they traveled and, the demons, depending on what you believe about demons. The Lei Ting and the Artukid coins really exist. The Lei Ting really are said to ward off evil, and the Artukid do promise a curse on anyone who damages them. Every quote that I read was a direct quote. The Battle of Yemen really did happen. It did end the Song dynasty. There was a massive and bloody slaughter. The demon poets were real. The book that I cited there is actual, but there is no evidence that they had a case of coins or that anything from the Battle of Yemen ever got exported. Chinese coins, however, did show up in England and were there when Shakespeare was writing. There's no evidence his father ever bought them, but he did die after 3 years without writing and editing, and his will is as I've described it here. There is inconsistent archaeological evidence about whether his head is in the gravesite, and the Stratford Society document about Frank Chambers stealing the skull is a real document. You could find it with a quick Google search. Increase Mather really did visit the Isle of Guernsey and live in the Cornet Castle, which is reputed to be haunted, by the way. There's a TripAdvisor review where there's a tourist who claims that staying in the castle immediately convinced him that evil was real and converted it to Christianity. Archaeologists really did find a 16th century corpse that really did have a gold coin where the stomach should have been. And Increase Mather, of course, really did move to Boston, where he was the first president of Harvard, was involved in the witch trials as described here. And the same is true of Cotton Mather, who really did found Yale. There is no record of either of them owning Chinese coins. That is just my invention for the story. Everything about Andrew Eliot's involvement in the witch trials is accurate, but everything about the coins is not. Since there were no coins, there's no evidence he touched them or had much involvement with either of the Mathers. He was the first immigrant of the Eliot family, and that did eventually produce T.S. everything in here about Victor Hugo is correct. He did go to Jersey. He did hold seances. He did receive the first scene of a play from Shakespeare. He did go to Guernsey, where he did report encounters with multiple evil spirits and did visit the Castle Cornet, but did not live in it. And all the quotes about T.S. Eliot and the demons are actual. He was involved in the occult. That was in the prior episode. And he was an intimate of Araj, and the dates concerning the relationship between he and Vivian are accurate. They did have an immediate wedding that no one could explain. They did not have a very happy honeymoon. They were strained at all times in their relationship. But everything about the demon possession is made up for the story. T.S. Eliot did have a way of being polite and cold at the same time, at least by the accounts of some of his biographers. No one I could find speculated about a ceremony involving Araj, Eliot, and Vivian. In fact, although they both attended seances and attended them together, Vivian wasn't much of a fan. Some consider Vivian a liability, but there are also those who will passionately defend her role as central to T.S. Eliot's body of work, that she was part of the creative force behind it. But whether sympathetic or dismissive about all accounts of her life, say that it was tragic, my hope here is that I've tried to humanize some of that tragedy, or at least portray her as someone caught in unfortunate circumstances. That much I'm sure is a pretty fair characterization of her life. And the rest, my friends, I leave to your imaginations. If you enjoyed this, listen to it again on Halloween night. That was, after all, the night that the War of the Worlds originally aired. Okay, it was October 30th, but I do think the follow-up that was published about it being a made-up story did come out on the 31st, and it is claimed to have been a Halloween prank. This is my own version of that War of the Worlds thing, presenting a story, Ghost Stories, if it's an actual podcast. So if you can listen to it on All Hallows Eve, please do. We are done with made-up ghost stories, but not done with Cats. Cats is one of the most successful musicals of all time, but has also been the source of some of the greatest failures in entertainment history. What's even more unusual is that the failures should have been can't miss, sure thing, softball wins. How do you team up Steven Spielberg and Andrew Lloyd Webber to produce something akin to the Star Wars Christmas special? How can you take an unlimited budget and put Taylor Swift in the show and barely make it out of the previews? Could it have been a curse passed down from... Whoa! Stopping myself. No more ghost stories, just the facts about the failures in the next episode of Theater History and Mysteries, coming in 2 weeks.
This is Orson Welles, ladies and gentlemen, out of character, to assure you that the War of the Worlds has no further significance than as the holiday offering it was intended to be. The Mercury Theater's own radio version of dressing up in a sheet and jumping out of a bush and saying boo. Starting now, we couldn't soap all your windows and steal all your garden gates. By tomorrow night, so we did the best next thing. We annihilated the world before your very ears and utterly destroyed the CBS. You will be relieved, I hope, to learn that we didn't mean it, and that both institutions are still open for business. So goodbye, everybody, and remember, please, for the next day or so, the terrible lesson you learned tonight. That grinning, glowing, globular invader of your living room is an inhabitant of the pumpkin patch, and if your doorbell rings and nobody's there, that was no Martian. It's Halloween.
Tonight, the Columbia Broadcasting System and its affiliated stations coast to coast has brought you The War of the Worlds by H.G. Wells, the 17th in its weekly series of dramatic broadcasts featuring Orson Welles and the Mercury Theater on the air. Next week, we present a dramatization of 3 famous short stories. This is the Columbia Broadcasting System.